So what I'm going to do is maybe follow on from what Laura and Kenny had to talk about, but pull the focus out a little bit and do that joining up piece between the day-to-day, the nuts and bolts of what we do, and the corporate strategy that Marika was talking about. And this, what I want to share with you is the thinking that we're doing and where we've got to on what our regulatory priorities should be. And Marika talked about those regulatory principles, and they are absolutely key. And I'll be banging on about those right through what I have to say. But the key ones here are around targeting and proportionality. We have, as Laura said, we've got a lot of discretion about what we do. How do we exercise that discretion? How do we explain to you, to the public, to individual charities, actually sometimes to ourselves, how do we explain how we're going to exercise our discretion? How do we set some expectations for the stuff that we're going to do, the stuff that we're going to concentrate on, and the stuff that we're not going to do? So that's what I want to talk about. So, just going back to those key corporate strategy priorities for the next 3 years. There's three really that I want to focus on here, that I want to link back to. That first one will ensure the public have access to the information they need. Will provide charities with the tools and guidance that they need, and will deliver smart, responsive and effective regulation that positively impacts on Scotland's charity sector and its beneficiaries. As Marika said, they're kind of hard to argue with. But, well, maybe not, maybe we will. But they are, they follow from the bones of the 2005 Act. They follow from the, quite closely from the spine of the law and the expectations that sets for us. But it's about transparency. It's about helping charity trustees to comply. And on that last one, it's about positive impact. And that's what I'm wanting to drill down to how we're thinking about how we do that. So I was talking about making choices about how we exercise our discretion. And what does that mean when you've got a sector that looks like this? When you've got a sector that, as we've said repeatedly this morning, it's diverse. It's I think Maureen said something like bizarrely sort of rich and diverse. We've got things like Edinburgh University, massive organisation, huge income, large numbers of staff, subject to a whole set of expectations because it's a university. We have scouts, we have guides, we have the village hall, we have environmental groups, lots and lots of animal welfare groups, preschool play groups, big subsector for us. What does it mean to be a targeted regulator? What is proportionality when you are looking at a sector like that, or indeed a sector that looks like this? So that is the profile of Scottish Charities by income. I think most people in this room will probably have a pretty good sense of this already. The pink stuff is the majority of Scottish charities. They have incomes between £0 and about £25,000. That's where the balance of our sector is. And then there's a really quite skinny bit where most of the income is, a small number of charities with quite high incomes. What does it mean to apply the same set of charity trustee duties, the same charity test, to a sector that looks like that? How do you make those choices? What does it mean to be proportionate when that's what you are looking at? And that's what we're wanting to apply our mind to, where we're wanting to go from what we know, and that includes, the issues that Kenny and Laura were talking about in terms of what we deal with incoming concerns. It's the data that we get from our surveys. Very much it's research and data from other people. I'll be talking about some very specific stuff there that we're very interested in and struck by. What does that mean for what we do? That's a very pocket version of some of the key regulatory principles there. We need to be proportionate, we need to be accountable, we need to be consistent, we need to be transparent. And what the Act actually says is we need to target what we do only at cases where action is needed. Heard about what that means day to day and how we've tried to refine that over the past few months in terms of our concerns and our inquiries activity. But we need to look at that across the piece. How do we target the scarce resources that we have in the right places? How do we take action where it's needed? And where it's not needed, how do we get out of people's way and let them do what they're best at doing? And Marika talked about some of the history of this. We first set out our risk framework back in 2016. That's done a really good job for us, particularly around the kind of risk assessment that Kenny was talking about in his talk. It's given us a really good basis for doing that. But that was before the pandemic, that was before the economic downturn, that was with a slightly different sector. Also, what we found it quite difficult to do is to translate that sense of risk, that set of priorities across the whole of what we do, not just the classic regulatory stuff about deciding what can and can't be a charity or what we should investigate and what we shouldn't, but how do we target and use our resources best in terms of helping charity trustees comply with their duties? How do we make that transition to having maximal transparency for the public? And how do we target that in a way that the best underpins public confidence and trust in regulation and in the sector? And it's about shaping both the regulatory decisions that we make, those sort of very defined, very solid, very appealable and reviewable regulatory decisions that we make. It's about shaping the conversations that we have with charities and with the kind of stakeholders, the intermediary bodies like yourselves, and today is very much a part of that. It's about explaining what we'll do as widely as possible and as clearly as possible. And again, Laura's talked about that in terms of the inquiry policy, but we need to do that across the piece. We need to give particularly members of the public who are interacting with us and interacting with charities an accurate set of expectations about what business we're in. And that business of setting expectations is key for any public body. Laura has talked a little bit about how people see us or see regulators in general. Sometimes they see us as, or they want to see us, or they hope to see us as very much the bad cop, going in hard, using our hard-edged powers, suspending trustees left, right and centre, freezing assets. Sometimes they see us as an inspectorate. We should be looking at all charities, we should be supervising all charities, we should be looking over charity trustees' shoulders in terms of the decisions that they're making. Sometimes they see us as an ombudsman, and that's a problematic area for us. We get a lot of the concerns that Laura and Kenny were talking about are from people who aren't happy with how a charity's dealt with them. They don't like a decision a charity's made. It hasn't provided them with a service that they're happy with, and they want someone who can take that further. That's not what we're designed for. That's not what our legislation is designed for. But it's worth thinking that there is that demand out there. And people see us as an advisor. And that's a really interesting one. One of the really interesting, pleasing, but slightly surprising things that came out of our Charities and Public survey last year was the sense that charities and charity trustees saw us quite high in the list of places they would go to for advice, which pleased us because it gave us a sense that we were seen as accessible and trusted, but also made us wonder whether we were in quite the right place there with that, and whether we were in a place there where maybe other bodies, other agencies should be. That's what we see in terms of other people's expectations of us to regulate. That's what we get through the door. What I'd be really interested in is the question we've got there. If you had to say, without too much thought, what word, short phrase would sum up your expectations of Oscar as a regulator, what would it be? So if you want to go into the app there, and let's see what comes up. Okay. Oversight. Proportionate. No, oversight and proportionate are battling it out. Yeah. Okay, so there's some real trends emerging there. There's a strong sense that we ought to be, or we are, or ought to be. Interesting question there. A supportive regulator, fair, proportionate, accessible. We ought to exercise oversight. Assurance is in there as well. Really interesting sort of balance there between supportive and oversight, and obviously those things aren't mutually exclusive either. Okay, thanks. That's really interesting, and maybe something we can take into the questions at the end there. I'll move on a little bit to where we're actually getting to, what we think we should be focusing on for regulation. There is an expectation among the public, if not the people in this room, and I think that's significant, that what we're about is enforcement. And sometimes we are. Sometimes we need to take action really quickly to protect assets, to protect individual beneficiaries, to prevent harm, to recover assets, all of those things. Where we have a persistent failure to comply. But the reality of being a regulator is much more complicated, and it ought to be much more complicated, because enforcement is often a very blunt instrument to deal with issues that may be more complicated, or I don't know quite how to put it, softer issues than simple willful misconduct. It's a very blunt instrument to deal with people's misunderstanding of what they ought to be doing. It's a blunt instrument to deal with honest mistakes, or people, charity trustees, who are dealing with genuinely challenging situations, and we do see that. Sometimes life is very tough for being a charity trustee, and our job is not to second guess people's difficult decisions. Our role is very much to help people to comply. That's a positive impact on the sector. The more charities where they are getting on with running the charity in a compliant way, productively providing public benefit, helping their communities, that's what a positive impact looks like. But what we need to do is shape public expectation around that. I think particularly, we're focused on the members of the public who get in touch with us about concerns they have about charities and how we shape those expectations and their sense of what we'll do and what we'll not do. But there are wider expectations that we need to look at as well in terms of what kind of regulator we need to be. So, what we have in mind at the moment are 5 broad regulatory priorities that we will concentrate on over the next 5 years. As I mentioned, these come out of what we know from our experience through our casework. They come out of things like the charity and public surveys we do. They come out of sometimes research that other charities have done, other sector bodies have done. They come out of what we know from charity accounts and conversations with charities themselves. We aren't the font of all wisdom on this. This is our first go at defining these kind of priorities for the next few years. These are conversations that we've had internally, and what we're wanting to do today is to have a conversation with you about them. We don't think that they'll be set in stone. In fact, that's not our intention. We will review them regularly, and we will keep up an external conversation about them. So, what's our first regulatory priority? First one is to deal with charities that fail to engage with the regulator and demonstrate to the public how they make a difference. So, failing to engage with the regulator, you can see why that bothers us. They're not talking to us. They're not complying with what they ought to do. So why is that important in terms of impact on the sector or on the public? If charities are failing to engage with the regulator on the one basic thing that every charity has to do every year, which is to submit an annual return and submit annual accounts, it bothers us because they're not talking to us. But the real key issue there is that they're not being transparent with the public. We know from the figures on our website that the charity register is hugely consulted. It's consulted by funders, it's consulted by the public, it's consulted by people who are wanting to interact with charities. If that basic duty to keep the register up to date isn't being met, then those charities are affecting transparency of the public. They're also slightly letting down the rest of the charity sector, because the vast majority of charities in Scotland are really good in terms of their uptake and their engagement with us. At the moment, we have 89-90% submission rates for annual accounts and the annual return. That is not as good as it was before the pandemic, and I think the pandemic is a real factor there, and I'll say why. It's not bad by national standards, but when we look at the rates that other charity regulators get, it's not the top, but it's not bad. We know that we can do better. We know that we can ensure a higher level of transparency for charities in Scotland. So there's an issue there about charities not meeting the legal duty. We also know that there's a whole range of issues that underlie that. Those can be very simple ones. People don't know that they're required to submit accounts. I think increasingly through the pandemic, we probably have a lot of charities that are quietly folded up and trustees have walked away, and we need to, if you like, clean up the register and use, I think, increasingly the new powers that the 2023 Act will give us to remove charities from the register to do that bit of business. We also have the situations where charities have a genuine difficulty in moving forward because there's something wrong with their constitution. They don't have enough trustees to make decisions to get their accounts passed. There's a range of approaches we can take there, and we have a lot of work going on at the moment to try and link up with charities that have failed on repeated occasions to engage with us, to submit their accounts. But at the end of that process, there will be a need to enforce that compliance. And so what we're talking about there is a range of ways of helping trustees, but also in the final analysis, making sure that we have an accurate register. The other regulatory priority is potential misuse of charitable assets for private gain. This is a slightly paradoxical one because, as Laura's already said, deliberate misconduct is pretty rare. Deliberate misuse of charitable assets is pretty rare, but it has a big effect. If we think about some of the news coverage that there's been this week about a big charity in south of the border and its use of its assets, the way it's been run, though that sort of coverage is really corrosive of public trust in charities. There is a strong public expectation that where deliberate misuse happens, we will act. That's what we think as well. Now, a lot of those kind of cases, it won't just be us involved. We will work with Police Scotland, prosecuting authorities, other regulators. Sometimes those kind of cases can be quite long, they can be quite complex. It takes a while to make a difference, but we can be very successful, for instance, in recovering assets and bringing those back into the sector. So although the numbers are low, the effect and the positive impact of dealing with those and being seen to deal with those is really high, and that's why that's one of our priorities. So the thing that isn't so rare and probably underlies a lot of the intelligence that we get about what's happening in charities is that charity trustees' understanding of some quite core governance matters and activities can be flawed, and it can be incomplete. So our evidence for that, the majority of the income and concerns we get, what they reflect is people not knowing what their quorum is, not knowing how to call an AGM properly. And sometimes that can be okay, you can get by with that, but once something goes wrong inside a charity, those things start to really destabilize it and become serious issues. What we need to do is to work with sector bodies, work with intermediaries to try and raise awareness among trustees of some of those really core things. And again, it's about thinking about what the shape of the sector is. We have a diverse sector, we have a sector with a lot of very small charities. So what are the issues in the majority of cases that we see, and how do we best deal with those? Some of that will be about things that we do. Some of that will be about working with the likes of third sector interfaces to deal with issues in their areas and helping them to give guidance and advice to trustees. Some of that will be about the guidance that we produce and making sure that's targeted and really accessible and deals with the key issues there. What it is very rarely about is enforcement. It is very rarely about taking, it's very rarely about suspending trustees, about freezing assets or any of the things that Laura's talked about there. These are the cases where we get to the end and we make recommendations. These are some of the things that Kenny talked about in terms of that low risk activity, where our reaction to a concern being raised with us will be to write to the trustees and say, okay, do you want to talk about this? Do you want to think about this? Here's an issue. Here's the problem with that AGM you just held. How about doing it differently the next time? It's also about what we're doing with our annual return process. And Laura and her colleagues are going to be around this afternoon to demonstrate that to some folks who are staying on. What we're wanting to do is to make the experience of completing the annual return for OSCR a bit richer and to make it a bit more about improvement and self-evaluation for charities. So it'll be a lot more intelligent, where there are some of those key issues that come up from the data that we're getting when charities submit it. Then we will be able to give some tailored guidance as part of that process. So that's a forthcoming attraction. And here's one of the ones that's kind of complicated. Kenny's talked a little bit about this. We see a lot of income and intelligence where what it reflects is a breakdown of trust inside charities, or a breakdown of trust between charities and the communities that they serve or they're part of. Sometimes those can be geographical communities. If we're thinking about the huge and very welcome growth in community bodies over the last sort of 20 or so years since the Land Reform Act in 2003. If we're thinking about the key role that charities can provide, especially in small rural communities, the likes of the village halls or community associations, but also communities of interest, charities that are set up to help people with particular issues, or charities that are set up to deal with particular problems in local areas or in particular sectors. And we had a slice of those in that sort of graphic that showed the diversity of the sector in Scotland. These can be really intractable. We are usually not the people who can help with this, because these can be issues that are very deep-rooted. They can reflect issues of personalities. They can reflect some quite deep-running issues of principle. They can reflect fissures in individual communities that the kind of thing a regulator does isn't going to help. We have had a lot of experience with this over the past couple of years. Some of the reports that we've published over the last few months deal with these kind of issues. But I'm thinking of a couple of cases that I've been aware of. One with a small village hall, where there were issues with governance, there were issues with AGMs being called, there were issues with who were the charity trustees and how many charity trustees should there be. But they weren't the underlying issues. The issue was a division within the community. And the kind of things that OSCR or any regulator can do in terms of, we could get rid of the trustees, we could freeze the assets, that's not going to help. they're difficult for anyone else to deal with as well, because in those and a few other cases I can think of, the local third sector interface had got involved, done a really committed job of trying to use its good offices to try and address the issues that were there, and had retired hurt, as it were, and you can understand why. In some cases, the local MSP had got involved and had found it very difficult to deal with the issues. So this is probably the one where our thinking is most exploratory, and I'm looking at some of the people that are here. I'd be really interested to hear some opinions on that. This is an issue. It's an issue within the sector. It's an issue that's very difficult to resolve by the classic regulatory means, but we want to make some positive impact on that. We want to work with others to make some positive impact on that, and we would like to explore with you what that looks like. The last of the regulatory priorities comes out of a conversation towards the end of last year, and some of you might have been there. This was at the gathering back in November. I don't know, whenever it was last year. It's November this year. But at the gathering, there's a really good presentation around some research that had been done by IVA on behalf of Funders Forum about charity reserves. Some really interesting conclusions coming out of that around the kind of thinking that charities do about their reserves, how charity trustees should, but often don't, think about the handling of reserves. But slightly chasteningly for OSCR, the impact that the regulator has on how charities deal with their reserves. And the problem there was that there is a general perception out there that we say a particular thing about reserves, which we don't say and have never said. So, how many months of reserves does OSCR say that a charity should keep? Anyone want to put a number on that?
3.
Yeah. The thing we hear all the time is, oh, OSCR says you should keep 3 months of reserves. We don't say that. We've never said that. What we say is you should have a good think about it. You should look in the context of what you're doing. You should think about why you're keeping those reserves. But we have clearly some work to do in terms of the impact that our advice is having on the sector. And it's about having a positive impact there, and also having an impact, thinking about the where charities are, coming out of the pandemic, coming out of the economic issues that we have at the moment. We know that reserves have been a crucial thing for many, many charities. More charities than ever before have found themselves dipping into their reserves, or having to make quite difficult decisions about whether to go into their reserves or what they should do. And our sense is that the way that we can make the most positive impact on that is by looking at what we say, the help that we give to trustees about how to think about reserves. Thank you very much.